Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast. As always, I'm your host, Kyle, and today we are finishing up our series on Rasputin, come hell or high water. This is past Kyle speaking right now, saying that I'm going to try to condense my words as best as I can writing this script, because this one might be a lot. But then again, you all know what you signed up for. You can see the length of the episode before you click on it, so bear that in mind. And on that note, Past Kyle out. Thank you, Past Kyle. Present Kyle here again. As I was saying, we are going to be wrapping up the life of Rasputin today, and to do that, we have to jump back in time a little bit. Where we last left off, we were in late 1912, and Rasputin fever gripped Russia like a vice. There were a lot of rumors of Rasputin doing this or that with these or those people, but all the evidence that turned up was not a whole lot more than a bunch of hogwash concocted to sell newspapers. Everyone knew that Rasputin was weird, and a creep, and a little religiously off the mark, but there was really no solid proof of anything. In fact, things seemed to be going the opposite way, as the investigations continued to roll on and turned up nothing, and Rasputin was finally declared not a Christ by an expert on the matter. In 1912, Rasputin was a powerful person because of his connections, particularly those to the Tsar and Tsarina, but he was realistically still on the fringes of power. He had some sway and influence on the royals, but broadly speaking, he was just a party-hardy leveraging his power and influence to go to fancy parties and keep the cops from throwing him out of town or into a prison or monastery somewhere. All of this, though, would change. Enter the year 1914. 1914 started like all the others since Rasputin landed in St. Petersburg. The city, really the whole country, spun around him like a vortex as he bounced around the country visiting fancy places and schmoozing with fancy people. But then things changed. On June 29th of 1914, Rasputin went somewhere allergic to fancy people. A place so mundane and inconsequential that if it weren't for the fact that Rasputin was there, it would likely have never been remembered in the first place, in order to, be forgotten. This would be Rasputin's home. Rasputin returned to Pokrovskaya. Rasputin's many visits home over the years were often shrouded in mystery and scandal, and this time would be absolutely no different. On the 29th of June, Rasputin received a telegram. The contents of the telegram aren't particularly important, but Rasputin just so happened to be there when the message was dropped off. Rasputin quickly scribbled his response and ran after the mailman to give it to him so that it could be sent off immediately. As Rasputin exited the gate outside of his house, he passed a woman. The woman looked at Rasputin and bowed. Rasputin told her, hey, there's no need to do any of that, and he reached for his wallet to give the woman some money as he thought she was a beggar. As Rasputin was reaching for his wallet, the woman stabbed him with a dagger right in his stomach. To Rasputin's surprise, this woman intended to kill him. And as you might imagine, Rasputin started screaming and yelling that someone was trying to kill him, and then he ran off. The mystery woman chased after him. As he ran, Rasputin called for help, and people started to gather to, see what's going on. At some point, Rasputin apparently was able to round a corner and pick up something heavy. His attacker rounded the corner, and Rasputin clubbed her over the head and knocked her unconscious. At this point, a huge crowd had gathered around the conflict. From the various stories that have come out since the incident, it appears that there are kind of two camps at the time. One were some people who wanted to do some good old-fashioned frontier justice on this lady. And two, there were those who approved of her actions and didn't really care that somebody tried to murder Rasputin. But ultimately, the cooler heads would prevail, and the woman was taken to the local administration building where she was locked up and interrogated by the police. Rasputin, for his part, promptly lost consciousness shortly after defeating his attacker. He wouldn't wake up for another 2 hours. Everyone around him was certain he would die. While Rasputin was fighting to stay alive, the local authorities interrogated the attacker. She was not particularly shy about what she'd done or her motives. Her name was Hyona Guseva. She was a young woman from the town of Tsaritsyn and a follower of the former monk, Iliador. Now, we have to talk a little bit about Iliador. Iliador, the same man that Olga Lakhtina sought out in our previous episode, was a man in a similar place as Rasputin. He was a man of very similar fame to Rasputin as well. He was a very fiery, passionate monk who imbued a certain excitement and life into the Orthodox Church that so many people had longed for in this very drab and boring time of religious drudgery. But he was also very different from Rasputin, too. Whereas Putin was a political man kind of on the down low, mostly influencing people within government, Ilyador was very explicitly political. He actively drove for political purposes and to very concrete ends. For one, Ilyador was a member of the Black Hundreds, and is what we would refer to as a fascist today. He was a virulent monarchist and nationalist who hated anything non-Russian and sought to destroy these influences by, well, any means necessary. At one point, Ilyador was a close associate of the Tsar himself, but ultimately his star waned and he was sent into exile where he was forced to live out the rest of his life in a monastery. But Ilyador was still powerful and he blamed Rasputin for the woes of the country. Guseva, for her part, said that Ilyador had told her that Rasputin was a false prophet, and that he was committing sins and crimes not only against God, but against the Russian Empire. So, Guseva took it upon herself to hunt Rasputin down and bring him to justice. And it just so happened that this was the man that her mentor so despised. As with everything else that was happening in this story so far, the news media took the story and ran with it as hard and fast as they could. Immediately after Rasputin had been stabbed, papers all over Russia, and then soon all over the world, would be reporting all kinds of made-up nonsense. Chiefly, they claimed that Ilyador had hired Guseva to kill Rasputin, and they all reported that Rasputin was dead. But the interrogation of Guseva was still ongoing, and many questions, like Ilyador's involvement, hadn't been answered yet. And then, to the other point, Rasputin was very much so not dead. Not yet. But he sure as shit was close. Immediately after his stabbing, Rasputin's family sent for medical attention. The nearest surgeon who would be able to help was in Tumen, which was days away. But as soon as they received the telegram, one Dr. Vladimirov and nurse Kuznetsov were dispatched to save Rasputin's life. It took them 2 whole days to get to Pokrovskaya. When they did arrive, Rasputin was in pretty rough shape. The medical team agreed they were going to have to do the operation here. If they took him to the hospital, Rasputin would die. But in spite of it being 1912, and the doctor and nurse being exhausted from 2 days of hard travel, and the operation being done in a hut, the operation was successful. They were able to suture up Rasputin's wounds, but there was no guarantee that he would live. For the next 2 days, Rasputin flitted in and out of consciousness. A priest would be brought in to deliver him his last rites. Rasputin was expected to die. As Rasputin's life hung in the balance and the Tsar and Tsarina began to hear about this, they became worried. Everyone had heard that the attack had happened at this point, and the Tsar and Tsarina were struck with very, very deep concern that, he's not going to make it. But one Marina Rasputina, Rasputin's daughter, sent a telegram directly to the Tsar and Tsarina to assure them that her father was alive, and that while he's not doing so great, he is getting better. Once they knew that Rasputin wasn't dead, the Tsar and Tsarina did, what emperors and empresses do. They employ force. Quickly, a massive investigation had begun, but this time, not to damn Rasputin, but rather to save him. Armed guards, soldiers, and policemen flooded into Pokrovskaya to collect evidence, do interviews, and make sure that no one else tried to harm Rasputin. And now, it was the Tsar and Tsarina's turn to pray for Rasputin, as he lay there on what seemed to be his deathbed. And this time, it was seemingly their own prayers that worked. Though, really, truly, the most interesting thing and kind of ironic thing is that this is almost exactly the opposite of what had previously happened with Alexei. This time, of course, it's very clear to see that the Tsar and Tsarina are praying for Rasputin, as opposed to the other way around. Actually, this is a time where prayer really doesn't even factor into it. Modern medicine is what saved the day. Whereas with Alexei, everyone points out, the doctors weren't able to save him. In this instance, if it was not for Dr. Vladimirov and Nurse Kuznetsova, Rasputin would absolutely be dead. But survive he did. And Rasputin was a number of things. But dead was not yet one of them. He had quite a bit left to add to the wonderful broth of the collapse of the Russian Empire that we will be getting into later. As Rasputin recovered from his wounds, the interrogation of Guseva continued. The police quickly found out that Guseva was not just a normal follower of Ilyador. She was a little bit off, and she'd been obsessing over Ilyador and Rasputin for quite a while. While under Ilyador's mentorship, she claimed that she had received euphoric visions from God, and that she had been visited by the devil who was in disguise as a monk. She also told police that Ilyador had told her that someone had to do something about this Rasputin guy. And then she straight up told them that, I am probably crazy and my family has a long history of mental illness. So, yeah, the police were like, okay, we're kind of just dealing with a crazy person now. They didn't really know what to believe. But then shortly after her interrogation, Rasputin got a letter. The letter was bragging that Rasputin had been defeated and he had been brought low and that his influence would never be there again to threaten Russia. Rasputin immediately took this to the police because he recognized the handwriting. It was the handwriting of Ilyador. The police took it in and they concurred. This was Ilyador's handwriting. And then they started to look a little bit more into this. And hoo boy, yeah, they quickly found out that Ilyador's fingerprints were all over this assassination attempt. It actually kind of seems that maybe Ilyador wasn't super interested in hiding his involvement. It seems like maybe he was thinking that he would, be crowned a hero or something for his actions. But a hero he was not. Now he's just number 1 wanted on Russia's watch list. Part of this wasn't just that he attempted to murder Rasputin, but also that while the Russian government were digging around trying to figure out his involvement in this assassination attempt, it turns out that they found out that Ilyador was maybe planning a couple of terrorist attacks as well. So they wanted to get this guy before he could hurt anyone else. But Ilyador would never be held accountable for any of his crimes or face any form of justice, because before anyone could catch him, he fled to New York City, where he would later become a janitor at the MetLife Tower. Like, no kidding, straight up, it's weird. He also has an IMDb page, which is also kind of odd. But anyhow, Rasputin had survived his brush with death. His assailant was behind bars, and the mastermind was hiding out on the other side of the world. Things were looking up. Wrong. Have you been paying attention to the date? I don't know how many of you all would know this off the top of your head, but something else happened right before Rasputin got stabbed in the gut. On June 28th of 1914, which technically would be the day before Rasputin was stabbed, but practically it was the same time due to slow communications of the day and time zones. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was murdered. You know what that means? World War I. With the power of hindsight, we know that shortly after this event, the world would fall into the clutches of the First World War, but this actually wasn't a guarantee at the time. For Rasputin's part, he was really worried about a war kicking off and expressed that concern frequently and adamantly to the Tsar. After surviving his immediate trauma, Rasputin was moved to a hospital where he sent constant telegrams to the Tsar and told him why he thinks Russia should not go to war. And then, when he felt that the Tsar wasn't listening enough, he started sending letters and telegrams to anyone in court who he thought might be willing or able to talk to the Tsar and get him to see sense. If you don't know what started World War I, let's do the Cliff Notes. Basically, it starts with a group of Serbian nationalists called the Black Hand killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austro-Hungary said that they were going to now start a war with Serbia. Serbia was an ally of Russia. Germany was an ally of Austro-Hungary and was really the one kind of bankrolling them. Russia and Germany were ruled by cousins. There was a lot of possibility for these two sides, particularly the two larger powers in this instance, Russia and Germany, to talk this out, or at least not allow it to turn into a giant war. Russia and Germany together, or just Russia alone, could have, say, backed out and let Austria-Hungary and Serbia deal with the situation themselves. But that would not happen. Honor and treaties dictated that these countries would go to war, even though the heads of Russia and Germany and Serbia all openly talked about how they did not want a war and were willing to negotiate with one another. So, there was a real chance that this war would not happen. Now, it seems hard to think that this was a possibility since World War I is such an important part of history and, has already happened. But to those in 1914, it really could have gone either way. Ultimately, a lot of it did come down to the Tsar and what he wanted to do. Without the Tsar's involvement, there would have been no Western fronts, as France only joined because it was Russia's ally, and Britain only joined because it was France's ally. And without the Tsar's involvement, the German support for Austria-Hungary would also dry up, as the conflict would now only be between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Not a conflict that Germany would likely see a need to get involved with. As well, the Serbians acquiesced to almost all of the demands that Austria-Hungary gave them after the assassination in order to, stop the war. Without Russian involvement, there would really be no cause for a wider war, if war even at all. It's hard to say necessarily what would happen, and these kind of what-ifs are oftentimes very silly. But it's pretty easy and clear to say that if this wouldn't have stopped war, that being Russia's lack of involvement, it at least could have maybe delayed the war or made the war smaller. But the Tsar was the Tsar. He was a spineless man, and a man who cared so very deeply for just the very image of his empire, and for the image of its ruler, that he seemingly sleepwalked into the conflict. The situation between Austria-Hungary and Serbia could only be resolved if Russia did something, if they backed out of the war, if they allowed Serbia and Austria-Hungary to broker their peace. To sit there and do nothing would be to allow this to happen. But Russia did nothing. The treaties and deals long brokered would take effect. Soldiers would be marshaled up and marched off. The Tsar would stand strong and not give in to the weak, effeminate voices of peace, and would trip face first into conflict. And when it was over, the empires at the root of this conflict, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire, would all be dead along with the millions of their collective subjects. What makes this so interesting is that not only was Rasputin against the war, but so was Alexandra, the Tsarina. Normally, the Tsar listened to his wife and to Rasputin, sometimes to his great detriment. But this time he would not. He knew what he had to do to be strong, or what he thought he needed to do to, keep Russia on the up and up. But not only did Rasputin and the Tsarina dislike the idea of war, many within the Russian democratic and court governments were staunchly against the idea of war. Even many of the nationalists, who so often rattle their sabers at even the slightest provocation, were quiet. Seemingly everyone knew that the war would be bad for Russia. Well, everyone except the Tsar. But to the monarchists, nationalists, and anyone else who adored the Tsar and saw him as God's perfect appointed ruler, they could not comprehend that the Tsar would go willingly into this impending catastrophe willingly. Someone had to be behind this. Someone had to be influencing the Tsar. And that someone had to be Rasputin. But at the end of the day, believe it or not, didn't fucking matter. On July 17th, the Tsar called up his soldiers for war, and on August 1st, 1914, war were declared. Like many of the other countries that would be sucked into the First World War, the Russian government and Russian society found itself possessed by a spirit of war. No matter what anyone actually thought, the public image was that the war was good, it was righteous, and of course, that Russia would win. Interestingly enough, Rasputin did not follow along this line of thinking. Even after the war began, he did not suddenly become pro-war. He did say that he believed Russia would win because of God's blessing and the Tsar's leadership, but at no point did he believe in the war. And then shortly after the war began, he was deemed fully recovered from his injuries and released from the hospital. Now that he was back out in the real world reeled as it always did when Rasputin was around. The news once again had everything to say about Rasputin. The talk of the day was that Rasputin, now well in his 40s, nursing a freshly healed stab wound, was off to the front to inspire the troops and bring Russia to glory. No, not so much. Rasputin did not fight in the war at any point. Instead, he was headed to St. Petersburg. Rasputin was going to see the Tsar. Then something happened. Something that hadn't really happened before. The Tsar left. Of course, the Tsar had left before at other times. He didn't just stay in a single room, but he'd never left like this. Normally when the Tsar left, he took his entourage, his family. He took Rasputin. He took everyone with him. But not this time. This time the Tsar left alone. The Tsar was headed to the front to help lead the war. Throughout the war, the Tsar would head to and from the front and back and forth from St. Petersburg. But he would be gone for long stretches, and at first this would be less common, but ultimately towards the end, he was basically gone forever. In his absence, he left a country. But not only a country, a whole empire. One that was ruled by a single man. A single man who was currently leading a war and not doing things like passing laws or appointing ministers or holding court. So, in his absence, someone else had to step in. Logically, this would be the Tsarina. With Nikolai gone, Alexandra was basically left in charge. And where went Alexandra, so went Rasputin. And without Nikolai there, Alexandra latched on even tighter to Rasputin. Now, the two would truly become inseparable. Alexandra relied on Rasputin for political help, personal help, and religious help. All the while, Alexandra continued, though with a slightly more limited success rate, to influence Nikolai. In this arrangement, Alexandra had realistically become one of the most, if not the single most powerful person in Russia, and Rasputin had become her second. And as the Tsarina consolidated her power and Rasputin drew even closer to that power, people noticed, and while all this happened, the war churned on, and these people began to see enemies of the Tsar, both real and imagined, everywhere. As you might imagine, Rasputin one of those supposed enemies. For one, he had elevated himself to a position of power way beyond his station, and people couldn't believe that he was there and that he was not the Tsarina's lover. To the court, it must have seemed quite odd that Rasputin had filled in for the Tsar in every other way, but somehow not in the bedroom as well. And as well, the fears of many who shunned modernity and clutched their Bibles at night were being realized. They were right. The Tsar was not in control. A woman and a filthy heretical peasant were. This served as immediate proof that Rasputin had been undermining and influencing the Tsar and Tsarina the entire time. In reality, of course, this is somewhat true, but not nearly to the level that anyone had believed. And even now in 1914, Rasputin was likely not as powerful as many had feared. The Tsarina was definitely a strong individual, and she had her own beliefs and ideas. A lot of people talk about Rasputin influencing the Tsarina, and that is true. But a lot of people basically write off every bad idea that she has as, well, it must have been Rasputin. And I see this as two things. One, it is a kind of looking back, somewhat monarchist view of, well, she was the person in power. Definitely at the time, it was, well, the monarchists are right, the monarchy is right. But even now, in the present, we look back and we want to find these monarchs sometimes that they're better than they were. They weren't. They were just as bad as you think. And so, it's easy enough to say, no, the monarchy's good, so it has to be someone outside of the monarchy. Then I think the other issue is, this is just sexism. That people can't understand and cannot comprehend that a woman was running the country. That a woman was doing this, for better or for worse. And, well, she can't run, so someone else has to be running beyond her. Someone else has to be doing this. And so you get that kind of wombo combo. Well, that's a bad idea, and of course the monarch wouldn't do that, so it has to be someone else. And she's a woman, and a woman can't lead, so it has to be someone else. And, well, the easy, kind of clear target is Rasputin. Because, again, he does have some of this sway. Just not as much as maybe some people would think. But either way, this stoked hatred for Rasputin that had already been simmering for almost a decade now. Rasputin had gone from a dark spot in the image of the Tsar's government to now a cancer growing deep within the brain of the Tsar himself. And Rasputin was not really doing anything to help with his image. In the spring of 1915, Rasputin visited a restaurant and club in Moscow called the Yar. This was a trendy place for Russia's high society, and Rasputin was immediately a little out of place there. Part of this was the fact that, he was a peasant, and the other part of this is he quickly made an absolute ass of himself as he got belligerently drunk and started molesting the female dancers on stage and started bragging very loudly and crassly about his influence on and connections to the Tsarina. This all culminated with a drunken Rasputin undoing his pants, whipping out his penis, and then being arrested by the police. As you imagine, this didn't go well. A lot of people were a little upset. At its worst, this moment showed Rasputin for who he really was, a rowdy, self-absorbed, sex-crazed alcoholic. At its best, this was a sign of Rasputin losing control under the stress. In my opinion, it's both. We know Rasputin was all of the things that people were saying he was. He was a drunkard, he was a sex maniac, and he was really rowdy and a bit self-absorbed. But he'd never done anything quite like this, not in public anyways. And we know he was not doing particularly well at the time. Someone had just tried to murder him. Half the country seemed to think the only problem there was that he lived. The other half of the country was obsessed with him and wouldn't leave him alone, and all the while the country was falling apart in a war that he was against, and he was someone now in authority. He also had other outbursts. Notably, he got into a physical fight with his own father, a man who before now had been pretty passive on everything, and who just kind of mostly stayed out of all this business. But somehow Rasputin had sucked him in. So it seems likely that Rasputin was some of the things that people were saying he was, but he normally could keep that, under control. Or at least under control enough that it didn't explode out in front of everyone. But he was losing control, and he was engaging in the same kind of destructive, excessive, hedonistic behaviors that he had been before, but at a rate that even Rasputin couldn't handle. And you want to know the crazy thing? Everyone knew about it. As with everything, it was all over the newspaper, and people within the Russian government came to the Tsar and Tsarina and begged them to send Rasputin away. And they didn't. Instead, they said that these were lies that were being spread to undermine Rasputin and the office of the Tsar. Alexandra went so far as to say that the people spreading these rumors were traitors, and that spreading the rumors was akin directly to attacking the empire, the monarchy, or the Tsar himself. But unlike so much of the drama that had happened previously, we know this happened, for real. There would not need to be an investigation, or any Okhrana tomfoolery. This time, it happened before everyone, and still the Tsar and Tsarina refused to believe it. And yet, somehow, not believing the bare truth before his eyes would somehow not be the stupidest thing the Tsar would do in the year 1915. No, that dubious honor would come in August of 1915, when the Tsar would take direct control of the Russian military. Now, why would Nikolai do that? Why would the Tsar, a man with basically no military command, training, experience, or ability, take control of, the entire military? It would be like if tomorrow we went to war and Joe Biden came out and said, and guess what? I'm going to be in charge of the whole thing. It makes no sense. And at the same time, pretty much everyone was against it. The military was against it. The Duma was against it. The Imperial Court was against it. And most importantly, Rasputin and Alexandra were against it. The number one reason all of these people were against the idea was exactly what I had just said. It made absolutely no sense and would absolutely make things worse, not better. At this point in the war, it was absolutely true that the war was turning out to be a little bit more intense and lengthy than anyone expected. And the Germans were proving to be a little bit more formidable than anyone had thought, and the Russian army was not particularly performing as great as everyone had hoped. But just about no one thought that the Tsar taking charge was going to fix any of that. Rasputin and Alexandra absolutely understood this fact, but they also had an ulterior motive. They hated it when the Tsar was at the front. When Nikolai was away, he was surrounded by his military commanders, and he was harder to reach, and then he was harder to influence. And Alexandra and Rasputin were not really allowed at headquarters. One, this wasn't really a place for a woman or just some random peasant. And two, the generals knew what was going on, and they knew the influence that Rasputin and Alexandra had on the Tsar, and they didn't like them influencing him, particularly because they were both anti-war, and the generals, are generally pretty pro the war. It's actually said that, and I don't know if this is true or not, but that there was an order to shoot Rasputin if he were to show up at Russian headquarters. I don't know if that's true, but I do know that Rasputin was absolutely not welcome there. Rasputin and Alexandra would not be able to influence the Tsar while he was away, and instead, his head would be filled with the ideas of the generals, and they were not big fans of that. But these were not the only reasons that people didn't like the idea of the Tsar going off to lead the country. Very quickly after taking control of the entire military, the Tsar found himself in the crosshairs of public opinion in a way that he'd never been before. It used to be that when the military fucked up, got people killed or lost territory, or generally just looked incompetent, the blame could be divvied up among the generals, or a scapegoat could be found. Not anymore. Now, if and when anything goes wrong, there's only one man who could be blamed. The man who has full control over the military. The Tsar. Now, all of Russia's military failures, which, trust me, there were plenty, would be blamed squarely at the Tsar. As a general rule, this is why people in charge don't lead militaries, other than the kind of clear power issue. But if you are the head of state and you are taking control of a failing war, it rarely ever goes well. As you might imagine, this made the Tsar a rather unpopular person. The war has been going on much longer than anyone had thought it would, and the numbers of dead and wounded were staggeringly high and only getting worse and worse. And all of a sudden, this was entirely the Tsar's fault, and there was no one else who could take the blame. And while he was away, fucking up a generation of Russia's men, Rasputin and Alexandra ruled the empire, now more than ever. Before, the Tsar would be coming back and forth from St. Petersburg and to the front, and he would, still kind of be in charge. But now, he was really gone. The power vacuum left by his absence was complete, and Rasputin and Alexandra were left to fill it. And as you might imagine, the cries against this kind of power balance that we have now was getting worse and worse. In particular, the cries against one Rasputin. You can't really critique the Tsarina in this instance because she's the Tsarina. She is the wife of the Tsar, so like it or not, she does have power. And also, she's the Empress, and again, like it or not, you gotta suck it up. Because you can't attack her, or else she might, have you shot for treason or something. So, Rasputin once again becomes a stand-in for the Tsar and Tsarina. But the interesting thing is, not everyone saw Rasputin as a stand-in. A number of people saw Rasputin as the absolute cause of all of Russia's woes. It wasn't, we're going to attack Rasputin because, hey, he's easier to take shots at than the Tsar is. Instead, no. Everything the Tsar is doing, everything the Tsarina is doing, it's all Rasputin. They blamed him for the Tsar's absence. They blamed him for Russia's failure in the war in the first place, and for pulling the Tsarina's strings. But in reality, only some of that was even kind of true. Rasputin was very against the war, and very against the Tsar's direct involvement in the conflict. As well, Rasputin had literally zero military power. He was never at the front, he never commanded troops, and he wasn't doing anything like damaging enough at home that it would actually fuck up the war. And lastly, he was, of course, influencing Alexandra some, but not as much as people back then maybe would have liked to believe. Alexandra took power for herself in the Tsar's absence, and used that power as she saw fit. This ultimately resulted in a slew of ministerial firings and a high turnover rate in the highest seats of Russian government. This, as you might imagine, is not good. This makes the country quite a bit more destabilized and makes things not get done. And it's likely that Rasputin did have some influence in this realm, asking the Tsarina to remove some people and hire others on his behalf, but it really seems that the Tsarina did this well enough on her own. But much like the Tsar, who up until now, the blame would be deflected onto someone else, the Russian people, especially Russian high society, found Rasputin to be a fitting scapegoat for all the Tsarina's blunders. Again, it's that same thing of, well, the Tsarina's, the Empress, so she can't be wrong. It's got to be someone else, and she's a woman. She can't run this place. Someone else has to be doing it. But this is a wake-up call to all of those 1915 monarchists, and I guess to the ones in 2024 as well, that the Tsar and Tsarina were absolutely plenty good at fucking up everything well enough on their own. They didn't need any help from anyone else. And it was that same belief of imperial monarchical excellence that pushed the Tsar to take control of the military in the first place. He thought his generals incompetent, and that he, Nikolai, was appointed by God to make Russia strong and wealthy, and that it was ultimately him, the man who had spent his entire life being kissed up to and never being told no, and always being praised and lauded, who could save Russia in 1915, even without any experience whatsoever in, say, leading a military, or fighting a war, or any of those other things that might be useful in a time like this. And while this was going on, Rasputin was still being his lecherous self. While millions were on the front fighting and dying for the glory of Russia, Rasputin found himself at lavish parties, gorging himself in the parlors of fancy men and women, and all the while, of course, sleeping around like it was going out of style. If Rasputin was known as a debaucherous weirdo before, the war years were really where he hit his stride. And when his drinking and lusting and his hunger for power became known to more and more people, the demands to do something about this outrageous man became louder and louder. Enter Felix Yusupov. Do you remember in the last episode we talked about Zenaida Yusupova, imperial princess and big-time hater of one Grigori Rasputin. Remember, the last time we heard from her, she was sending a letter to her son, Felix, and she was telling him about how she really didn't fucking care for this Rasputin guy. Well, we're pretty sure that Felix never actually read that letter. As it turns out, in 1912, when Zenaida Yusupova sent that letter, her son Felix was more interested in just generally being a fop and just taking in the pleasures of high society. Felix wasn't really interested in politics, and Rasputin was not really someone he was spending a lot of brain power on. But one day, that changed. I'm not entirely sure when or why, but probably sometime about 1915, Felix got it in his head that Rasputin was a threat, and he started talking very openly about his desire to do something about him. Felix decided that Rasputin was a direct threat to the Tsar and to the imperial government, and that the only way to fix the issue was he was going to have to kill Rasputin. And so, a plan was set in motion. As I said before, Felix was a real dandy and a socialite. He was not a military man, or even a particularly serious one, so he did an incredibly bad job of keeping any of this under wraps. He told just about anyone who would listen that he was going to kill Rasputin. But sooner or later, Felix had gathered together a few kindred spirits interested in removing the Rasputin menace. One of these people was a Duma minister named Borshkevich, and one was even the Tsar's cousin, Dmitry Romanov. And Felix himself was a member of the royal family, so we got some pretty high-caliber social figures here. So, now with a crew together, the world's fanciest murderers got to work hatching a plan to kill Rasputin. It would all go down on December 30th, 1916. The plan was Yusupov would invite Rasputin to his house, and they would poison his wine, and that would be that. Or, well, so they thought. When the night of December 30th rolled around, Rasputin did come to the Moika Palace, Yusupov's home, supposedly to meet Felix's wife. Felix told him that she was running late and offered him some wine, and that wine had been in fact laced with cyanide. Rasputin, never a man to allow free booze to go to waste, happily took some of the wine. And nothing happened. The perpetrators were stunned. Rasputin had been completely unaffected by the poison and was starting to get a little impatient because Felix's wife hadn't shown up, and it was the middle of the night, and Rasputin was not really having fun sitting in Felix's basement doing nothing. But fortunately, or really rather unfortunately, for Rasputin anyways, things were about to get much more exciting. After Rasputin didn't die from the poison, Felix went upstairs to his co-conspirators and said, "Hey guys, what the fuck are we gonna do?" And this is when it was decided they were gonna have to take a bit of a more direct approach. Yusupov was going to shoot Rasputin to death in his basement. And that's exactly what he did. At about 2:30 in the morning on December 31st of 1916, Felix Yusupov shot Grigori Rasputin to death in his basement. Yusupov had landed a clean hit into Rasputin's side, and Rasputin fell to the ground unmoving. Now came the question. What do we do now? In order to make things look kosher, 3 of the conspirators went to Rasputin's house with one of them dressed up like Rasputin. This way, it would look like Rasputin had just been out and he had come home late. Not like, he'd been murdered in a basement somewhere. This left Yusupov and Pushkarevich, the Duma minister, alone with the body of Rasputin. After a short discussion, they decided they would go to a nearby bridge and dump Rasputin's body into the frozen Neva River. The thought was that when he was thrown in the river, it would be impossible to find his body, and that when it was found months later, when the river thawed, the heat would have died down a little bit, and his body would be so, disfigured from being in a river for months, that there would be little info that the investigators could glean from it. So, with the plan set, the 2 men headed down to the basement, and to their great surprise, Rasputin was not in fact dead, and was now about to teach them an important lesson in why you double-check things before moving on to the next step. When the men entered the basement, Rasputin attacked them. Now, Rasputin was a pretty big man, and he was a peasant, so he was kind of buff. He was more than enough to throw off some old squishy Duma minister and a young royal dandy. Rasputin blew through Pushkarevich and Yusupov and started sprinting out of the palace. When the remaining conspirators caught up to Rasputin, he was fleeing through a courtyard at the edge of the palace. So, the 2 men stopped on a balcony that led down to the courtyard and started shooting. Pushkarevich fired 4 shots. One hit Rasputin in the back, and another hit him in the head. At this, Rasputin dropped like a sack of potatoes. This time, or so they thought, Rasputin was dead for good. Pushkarevich and Yusupov continued on with their plan and took Rasputin to a nearby bridge and dumped his body in the Neva River. The next morning, everyone knew something was up. Rasputin was a mainstay of the Russian court life, and he was nowhere to be found. And almost immediately, people were like, yeah, that guy got murdered. This is probably not super surprising to anyone because, well, a lot of people already wanted to murder him, and just about 2 years ago, someone else tried to murder him. So, with literally no one surprised, the police began searching. And this is where Yusupov and company's plan turned out to be foolproof. Actually, this is where it turned out that they were fools. The police almost immediately found where Yusupov and Pushkarevich had dumped the body. They found the bridge, and wouldn't you know it, there was blood all over it. And then they found a boot nearby. So, all of 2 days after the murder, the police had found Rasputin's body as well. And not long after that, they figured out that it was Yusupov. Remember, Yusupov basically told anyone and everyone what he was planning on doing. It's nothing short of a minor miracle that Rasputin himself didn't know what was going on. So, quickly the conspirators were rounded up, and absolutely nothing was done to them. Like, half of them were royalty, at least one of them was a Duma minister, and all of them were aristocrats. But even without any kind of justice being doled out, they did continue the investigation, and an autopsy was done. This is, of course, within the greater mythos of Rasputin, when his penis was taken. And they found something interesting. In Rasputin's lungs was water. This seems to imply that the gunshots were not what killed him, but rather that he had drowned in the Neva River. Or, well, this is all how the story goes. The story that I've told you so far about Rasputin's murder is mostly a myth, a fabrication, a story made up by Felix Yusupov years after the events actually happened, mixed with a little bit of common urban legend. In reality, we don't actually know a ton about what happened on the night of December 30th and the morning of the 31st in 1916. What we do know is that Felix Yusupov and a gaggle of co-conspirators did in fact kill Rasputin. He was shot to death, and that he was shot 3 times. Once on the side, once in the back, and once in the head, the final shot that killed him. This is all according to the autopsy. Then we do know that his body was dumped in the Neva River. And one of the kind of interesting things, and really what this all boils down to, is the events that happened inside of the Yusupov palace, inside the Moika palace. This is all Yusupov saying it. There's not a lot else. I mean, all the people who were there were, the people who were part of this conspiracy. And Yusupov himself wrote a lot of this down in his memoirs. These other guys weren't as particularly famous as him, and don't get all the credit. There's a reason why Yusupov is the name that you keep hearing, and not all the other guys. It was his plan, it was him who wanted to kill Rasputin, and ultimately, it was his story. So, basically everything that happened inside the palace is super muddy. And, like I said, Yusupov, he was the guy who more or less invented most of this that's going on. Not long after Rasputin's murder, Yusupov fled the country because, the civil war and the fact that they were killing anyone who was vaguely related to the Romanovs. So, he fled to Paris, where he lived out the rest of his days in kind of serious opulence because he is a royal person, and he made money off of his fame and selling his story about Rasputin, chiefly by writing a bunch of books about, about that time I murdered that guy, the novel, the stage play, Rasputin's murder on ice. But this makes things really kind of muddy, because he paints himself as the hero who was destroying a cancer on the Russian people and Russian society. But we kind of know that some of this isn't true. We know that he is really propping himself up. Those who knew Yusupov then, and those who are kind of familiar with him now, know that even up to the time that he committed the murder and said, yes, I'm doing this for Russia, knew that he was not a political man, and that he mostly was just interested in, being a court guy. Mostly just interested in doing things that brought him money and entertainment and whatever. Even the Tsar's daughter points out that he is a really not patriotic or political dude, especially because to her she found this very upsetting. He wouldn't enlist in the military. He did not take part in World War I at all. So, it's kind of believed that he more or less just did this to make clout. He was trying to kill Rasputin because, and he was right, he would become very famous for doing so. And so, this is, I don't know, it's weird because maybe he thought this. A lot of people did. A lot of people did think Rasputin's the thing that's destroying Russia. And maybe Yusupov did think that. His mother, for one, certainly did. So, kind of makes sense that maybe she kind of put those ideas in his head and ran with it. Or it could be that Yusupov was just being Yusupov, and Felix decided, yep, I gotta kill this guy because, hey, it's gonna make me look good. But who knows? So what we have at the end of the day is that Rasputin was shot, not poisoned or drowned, and that comes from the autopsy. And Yusupov likely conducted this murder for personal reasons rather than any lofty, high-minded goals. But this does leave a few unanswered questions that, beg answering. Chiefly, what happened with the poison? And why was there water in his lungs if he didn't drown? So, to answer the first one, we turn to the testimony of one Dr. Lazavet. Lazavet was one of the conspirators, and it was his job to procure the poison to kill Rasputin. But according to Lazavet, he got cold feet and decided that he didn't want to kill anyone. So, before the murder, he switched the poison with an innocuous powder that did nothing. And to answer the second question, the one about the drowning, well, we have to turn to the coroner's report. The coroner actually addressed this in his report. He said that he was certain that Rasputin was dead before being thrown in the water, and that it was the shot to the head that had killed him. The report said that there was water in his lungs, but that it probably just came from the fact that he'd been hanging out in a river for 2 days before he was drug out, and that there were no signs that he had inhaled any water. So, there you go. Myths busted. Case closed, right? Well, not entirely. Almost all of the info, as I was saying earlier, comes from Yusupov himself, and from testimonies of the people who were conspirators. They tell us the timeline, and they tell us the conspirators who were there, but maybe not all of them. Maybe there are things they left out, added in. We don't really know. It's up to these wealthy, fancy people who absolutely know that, hey, people are going to be reading about this. Fuck, Yusupov's going to probably write it all down and sell it to make rent. Which, of course, he did. So, it's kind of hard to believe some of these things, but that's all we have. We just have what these folks told us. But even in these kinds of stories, there are still quite a few gaps. So, people have filled in some of those gaps. Or, really more likely, they've invented random shit whole cloth. One myth that has been circulating quite a bit from then until now, but more so then than now, is that the British government was somehow involved in the killing of Rasputin. Some people even go so far as to say that it was a British agent who fired the killing shot. This was a very popular story in 1916, as the British and the Russians were somewhat unhappy allies. They were really only allies of allies, and were held together originally only by their separate alliances with France. Their relationship was, tense. In particular, the Germans and Austro-Hungarians really liked to peddle in this myth and actively worked to spread it around in an attempt to undermine the relationship between the UK and Russia. But at the end of the day, this will have to be squarely categorized as a myth because there's really no evidence of British involvement. The closest thing to evidence that we have is that the UK National Archives show that the ambassador to the Russian Empire at the time, a man named George Buchanan, was aware of the murder plot for about a week in advance and didn't do anything about it. This is not exactly what I would call proper involvement, because again, everyone knew about this. Yusupov told everybody, and Yusupov was a friend of the British. He had gone to school there, so not particularly surprising. But much like the legends of British involvement, people have come up with tons and tons and tons of different theories, myths, and legends to fill in the gaps to make the story larger than life. Unfortunately, we can't get into all of them because there's tons and they have changed so much over the years. It's just, you know them. Whether or not you know that they're myths or not, I'm certain you know them. Ask somebody about how Rasputin died, and you will hear a lot of different little details. Again, we know the kind of broad stuff, but it's those little things, little connectors that don't work. But anyhow, back to the real world. The death of Rasputin could not have felt any more larger than life than it already was. It absolutely brought the world to its knees. Remember, Rasputin's a household name. This would be like hearing that, say, Betty White died, or the Queen died, or something like that. The Tsar and Tsarina in particular reeled at the death of their closest friend, confidant, and advisor, and the Rasputin's detractors absolutely reveled at their ultimate victory. The fate of Russia seemed open once again, and for the first time since the weird Siberian mystic had set foot in the Tsar's orbit. Finally, the government could work as it was supposed to, and the war, the economy, and society would be brought back on the right course. No, not so much. As it turns out, like I was saying earlier, the Tsar and Tsarina and the entire imperial government was plenty good at fucking everything up well on their own. Even without the presence of Rasputin to influence the Tsar and Tsarina, things continued to get worse. The war was not getting better abroad, and the country continued to destabilize at home. Much like before when the Tsar went to take control of the army, now all the eyes were on the royals, and there was no one else they could shift blame to. Everyone was watching the Tsar and the Tsarina, and they were not liking what they saw. In only a little over 3 months after Rasputin's murder, the Tsar would abdicate power for the first time in the history of the Russian Empire. And not long after that, the Russian Empire would be no more. And in just over a year from the Tsar's abdication, the Tsar, the Tsarina, and all of their children would be killed in the same revolution that killed their empire. It's hard to say if Felix Yusupov's actions led to this, or if this was coming anyways. People were already angry, and revolution had been in the air since at least 1905. People were angry at the Tsar and his government, and they were out for blood. So it's entirely believable that this fate would have befallen the royal family anyhow, and that Russia was kind of just doomed to this fate anyways. But it does seem that maybe Yusupov kind of sped things along. Whatever else can be said, it is pretty clear that Yusupov's actions did not do what they were supposed to, or well, at least what he claimed they were supposed to. In killing Rasputin, Felix Yusupov did not in fact save Russia. And with that, we have reached the end of the life of Rasputin. So now you're just stuck with me. I'm going to try to make this short here, because I am aware that we're already kind of taking up a little bit of time, but I do want to take this time to discuss a little bit about what I personally think of the story of Rasputin. To me, the story of Rasputin is a really interesting one. It's one of those stories from Russian history that pretty much everyone knows at least a little bit about, which is honestly kind of weird for Russian history. There's not a lot of other stories that I know people can say, hey, I know just maybe more than a name about that person. His story of debauchery, magic, religion, violence, and royalty seems to latch onto something in our brains. And as such, we have so many different myths and legends about the man, and this is not helped by the fact that so much about him was made up to boost or tear him down, and that we actually don't really have a lot of very concrete information on the man. So, what do I think of Rasputin? All in all, he was a gross, drunken lecher who had an addiction to power, wealth, and influence. I think he was all of the things that everyone said he was. I don't agree with every story, of course, and I don't think he was a beast, but he certainly seemed to be an unpleasant, pretty gross person that I would not have liked to have been around. But at the end of the day, I think the only reason that we care about him, and the only reason they cared about him then, was because of who he was attached to and where he came from. At the end of the day, the only reason people cared about him was because he was a peasant slumming it with the royal family. If he'd been just some random peasant, then of course we would know literally nothing about him. But if he was royalty, an aristocrat, a business magnate, whatever, if he was somehow influential and important on his own, he would never have been held to task over any of the things that he did. For every Rasputin out there, there are a dozen members of royalty doing worse shit that gets ignored because of their name. All of the things that Rasputin was doing, the same people who hated him were doing. They were also drinking, whoring, being generally gross, and even playing with new understandings of religion. The only difference was that Rasputin came from Pokrovskaya, not Moscow or St. Petersburg. It's funny, but ultimately what made him a gem, that he was a person from, outside of the normal orbit, a man with worldly peasant ways, is ultimately what I think is the core of what made him a villain. And with that, we must bid our friend Rasputin adieu. I've had a lot of fun making this series and learning about Rasputin, and I hope that you have as well. As always, if you did like the series, or even if you didn't, please let me know. I'm always interested in your opinions on the show. But for now, it's time to wrap this one up. Thank you all for listening. I hope you are all having a good day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.